Hey guys, tonight we slip back through the desert air of ancient Egypt, where the night is thick with the scent of Nile reeds, and the sandstone walls of Thebes glow faintly in the moonlight. You're standing just outside the palace gates, sandals sinking into dust that's been walked by pharaohs and priests for centuries. The air hums with cicadas, and torches flicker in iron brackets, casting long shadows that make every doorway look like it's hiding a secret. This is where Hatshepsut's life begins, inside one of the most powerful dynasties the world has ever known. Of course, you probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes in this court without accidentally offending someone important. A wrong bow, a misplaced word, and boom, you're back out in the dust, if you're lucky. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm always curious to see where and when you're listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're stepping into Thebes in the early 16th century BCE. The city is alive with the pulse of empire. Markets bustle with baskets of dates, fish pulled from the Nile slap wetly on reed mats, and priests file in and out of temples dedicated to gods whose names still echo today. In one of these royal residences, a baby is born to Pharaoh Thutmose I and his queen Ahmose. That baby is Hatshepsut. As a child of the royal household, her life is far from ordinary. She grows up surrounded by towering columns carved with hieroglyphs, by golden statues of falcon-headed Horus, and by servants who make sure her sandals are tied before she even thinks about walking. But Hatshepsut isn't just another daughter of the palace. Her bloodline is unusually pure. Both her parents carry strong royal credentials, which strengthens her legitimacy in ways that will matter greatly later. Historians still argue whether young Hatshepsut was treated as a potential ruler from the start, or if she was simply another princess expected to play the background role of royal wife and priestess. What's certain is that she was educated to a high degree. You can almost picture her as a little girl reciting ritual prayers, learning how to read sacred texts, and listening as tutors explain the duties of high priests and governors. She's absorbing lessons about diplomacy, religion, and ceremony, things a future pharaoh would need to master. One quirky tidbit: Egyptians believed in protecting children with magical amulets shaped like frogs or scarabs. Somewhere among her toys, Hatshepsut probably had one of these charms dangling around her neck, thought to keep away evil spirits and tummy aches. Imagine playing dolls while also wearing a talisman designed to ward off demons. Childhood was multitasking even back then. Her father, Thutmose I, is remembered as a strong ruler who pushed Egypt's borders further than before. When she's still young, Hatshepsut might have seen troops marching home with loot, strange animals, and prisoners from Nubia and the Levant. The pomp of victory parades, the sound of trumpets and drums, the sight of captives chained in a line. This is the environment shaping her childhood. And while most little girls might dream of wearing jewelry or dancing at festivals, you get the sense Hatshepsut is already studying how power works, quietly watching her father handle ceremonies and commands. One mainstream historical fact: she held the title of God's wife of Amun as a teenager, a role that gave her both spiritual influence and political clout. It was more than a religious job, it came with estates, wealth, and prestige. So while you're imagining her as a young woman sweeping through the temple in linen robes, remember that this isn't a quiet monastic life, it's one of immense privilege and responsibility. As she grows, palace life continues to weave itself around her. Musicians pluck harps in echoing halls, scribes dip reed pens into black and red ink, and the smell of fresh bread drifts from clay ovens. At night, the royal family gathers under oil lamps, while outside the city is alive with croaking frogs and the occasional bray of donkeys. It's all very cozy, except for the politics lurking in every corner. Because here's the thing, the Egyptian court is less like a peaceful family dinner and more like a reality show where everyone secretly hopes to outlast the others. Brothers, cousins, and stepmothers all have competing stakes in the throne, Hatshepsut's childhood isn't just one of luxury, it's one of constant awareness that the crown is never far away, and that anyone related to it walks a fine line between safety and danger. There's a delicious irony in all this, while later on she will be erased from monuments, chiseled away, as though she never existed as a child. She's almost overprepared for survival. Her education, her priestly role, her sharp observations, all of it is laying groundwork for a reign nobody yet suspects she'll have. And if you picture her now drifting off to sleep on a linen-covered bed with perfumed oils rubbed into her skin, you can almost imagine the future waiting quietly at her door. The whispers of priests, the shuffling of servants, the soft crackle of oil lamps, they all form the lullaby of a young princess who doesn't yet know that history will one day call her pharaoh. You wake again inside the palace walls where the sandstone glows honey gold in the morning sun, and the air smells faintly of lotus blossoms set out in shallow pools. The palace staff stir with their daily rhythm, linen rustling sandals slapping stone, a chorus of voices carrying trays of figs, beer and bread. Somewhere in the middle of this bustle, Hatshepsut has reached young adulthood, and with it comes the next chapter of her carefully choreographed life, her marriage to Thutmose II. Now on paper, this isn't exactly a storybook romance. Thutmose II is technically her half-brother, a younger son of Thutmose I, by a different queen. Ancient Egyptian royalty was big on keeping things in the family, literally. The closer the blood, the stronger the legitimacy. So you can imagine the wedding not as hearts and flowers, but as a political handshake dressed in gold and incense. Picture the ceremony. Priests chanting in booming voices, the air heavy with myrrh, smoke attendants fanning the couple with ostrich plumes. Hatshepsut is wrapped in gleaming linen, a broad collar of turquoise and gold around her shoulders. Thutmose II stands beside her, not quite the picture of strength his father had been, but the weight of kingship already pressing on him. Together they present an image of dynastic unity, sibling spouse, and soon co-ruler. Historians still argue whether their marriage was affectionate chilly or just perfunctory. The sources are frustratingly silent. What we do know is that it cemented Hatshepsut's position in the royal family. She wasn't just a princess anymore, she was the great royal wife, the top-ranked queen, the visible counterpart to Pharaoh. Here's your quirky tidbit for the night. Egyptian weddings didn't involve rings or vows like ours. Instead, the act of moving into the same household with the woman acknowledged as wife sealed the deal. So Hatshepsut probably didn't get a dramatic "you may kiss the bride" moment, just a new set of chambers and a slightly heavier set of responsibilities. Once married, her role expands. She performs rituals beside her husband, offering libations to gods, appearing in public ceremonies, and ensuring that the image of divine kingship is complete. In festivals, she walks with dignity through temple courtyards, her perfume mingling with incense, her gold bracelets clinking softly as she raises offerings. You can almost see the crowds lining the processional way, cheering the summer heat pressing down, and the Nile glimmering in the background. Meanwhile, life in the palace goes on with its strange mix of comfort and tension. Musicians strum harps at banquets. Dwarfs, considered lucky in Egyptian culture, dance for amusement, and scribes keep meticulous track of palace supplies, oils, bread, linen, honey beer. Yet behind all this, there are whispers that Thutmose II is not the strongest of rulers. He ascends young, and illnesses seem to cling to him. Relief carvings show him almost delicate compared to the bold lines of his father. And here's where you, standing in the middle of this painted hall, start to notice something. Hatshepsut isn't content with ornamental roles. She's smart, confident, and knows the rituals better than most priests. When her husband struggles, she steps in, she presides over ceremonies, gives orders to officials, and ensures that the machinery of state keeps grinding. One mainstream historical fact is that Thutmose II fathered a son, Thutmose III, by a lesser wife. Hatshepsut herself bore a daughter, Neferu, but not the male heir everyone anxiously expected. This sets up a looming problem when Thutmose II eventually fades. Who will rule the child, by the secondary wife or the queen, who already behaves like she belongs, on the throne? At night, the palace would quiet. Oil lamps glow in painted chambers, and the muffled sounds of distant drums echo from festivals in the city. You might think of Hatshepsut here, lying awake on a bed with carved lion legs, staring at the ceiling while plans spin silently in her head. She has seen her father's reign, she knows how fragile power is, and she understands the stage she's walking onto. Imagine the irony. While her official role is supportive spouse, the reality is that she's practicing for solo command. It's like playing second violin while secretly learning the conductor's part, and soon enough the performance will change, because illness will take Thutmose II, leaving a child heir too small to hold a scepter. But for now, in these palace years, the marriage holds the dynasty together. The sandstone walls echo with ceremony, and the daily drone of priests, while behind closed doors, the quiet calculations of a future pharaoh begin to take root. The palace is hushed tonight. Torches flicker along the sandstone walls, but the usual clamour of servants and musicians feels subdued, as though even the walls themselves know something has changed. You wander the corridors and sense a heaviness in the air. Thutmose II is gone. His body wrapped in linen is already being prepared for the rituals that will secure his place in the afterlife. And just like that, Egypt faces the precarious question of succession. You'd think the throne of the most powerful kingdom on earth would come with a smooth user manual, but no, here it passes not to a seasoned adult but to a child. Thutmose III, the son of a lesser wife, is still a boy, barely old enough to hold a reed pen properly, let alone command armies, which leaves Egypt with an awkward gap someone has to rule until he grows up. Enter Hatshepsut. The title she takes on is regent, which sounds like a temporary babysitter role. But when the baby in question wears a crown of gold and the empire's stability hangs by a thread, being regent is more like holding the steering wheel while pretending you're just a helpful passenger. You can almost picture the first regency scenes. Officials gather in a columned hall, their voices murmuring under painted ceilings. Thutmose III sits there, small and wide-eyed, dangling feet not yet touching the ground, while Hatshepsut stands tall beside him. She speaks for him in rituals, signs decrees in his name, and manages the machinery of empire with the calm assurance of someone who's been training for this moment her whole life. Historians still argue whether Hatshepsut intended from the start to seize more power, or if her gradual rise from regent to pharaoh happened because circumstances demanded it. Was she an ambitious mastermind, or simply the only adult capable of holding things together? The debate lingers like incense smoke in the temple halls. One mainstream historical fact: she had her daughter Neferua serve as God's wife of Amun in this period, stepping into her mother's old religious office. It wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. By positioning her daughter in this prestigious role, Hatshepsut wove her family directly into the divine machinery that legitimated kingship. Clever move. Quirky tidbit child kings often had ritual playtime with miniature versions of royal regalia, so somewhere in the palace little Thutmose III might have been running around with a toy scepter or crown practicing his role, while Hatshepsut handled the real power. Imagine the awkwardness of everyone bowing solemnly to a boy who's still missing baby teeth. Life at court doesn't pause. Festivals still need celebrating, taxes still need collecting, and the Nile still rises and falls with its ancient rhythm, as Regent Hatshepsut presides over processions, leads prayers to Amun, and ensures that the empire's facade of stability remains uncracked. But beneath the rituals, you sense a quiet shift. Officials begin addressing her with more deference, priests linger longer when she enters a temple, and foreign envoys know whose approval truly matters. At night, the palace whispers. Some courtiers probably mutter that a woman's influence should stop at regency. Others, perhaps exhausted by the uncertainty of child kings, are secretly relieved that an experienced hand is steering the ship. And Hatshepsut, lying awake in her perfumed chamber, hears it all. The soft footsteps of servants outside, the occasional screech of a nightbird, and the unspoken question humming in the silence. How long will she remain just regent? Egypt's story has always been one of continuity, where pharaohs claim divine blood to keep chaos at bay. And right now, the continuity runs through Hatshepsut. She isn't wearing the double crown yet, but the way she moves, the way she commands you, can almost see it waiting on her brow. The boy king beside her grows slowly, but the queen regent's authority grows faster, stronger, steadier. And so while Egypt officially has a child pharaoh in practice, the land is already learning the calm, deliberate style of the woman who will one day call herself king. The sun blazes over Thebes, striking the whitewashed walls of temples until they shimmer like mirrors. In the courtyards, priests shuffle barefoot, their shaved heads glistening in the heat as they chant hymns that have been sung for centuries. And in the palace, something subtle but momentous is happening. The regent is no longer content with being merely the guardian of a boy king. Hatshepsut is shaping herself into something Egypt has never quite seen before, a woman who steps across the invisible line and claims the throne not as queen, but as pharaoh. The transition isn't done overnight. It's careful, deliberate, almost theatrical. At first, decrees still appear in the name of Thutmose III, with Hatshepsut's hand clearly behind them. Then gradually she begins to layer her own authority on top titles, multiplying like lotus blossoms after a flood. God's wife of Amun becomes king's great wife, then king's daughter, and eventually she claims the ultimate title, Pharaoh, the Horus in the flesh. Historians still argue whether this leap was a hostile takeover or a peaceful evolution. Was Hatshepsut shoving her stepson aside, or was she simply stabilizing the kingdom during a vulnerable moment? No one can quite agree, but what's clear is that by the 7th year of her regency, she is no longer pretending. She's sitting on the throne wearing the double crown and issuing commands as His Majesty. Of course, you can't just stroll into the throne room one morning and say, "Surprise, I'm king now." You need props, you need spectacle, and Hatshepsut has a knack for both. She begins appearing in statues and reliefs, wearing the false beard of kingship, broad chest exposed like a male ruler, muscles carved where none existed, yet her face still soft, serene, unmistakably hers. It's visual code switching, a female body dressed in the iconography of male kingship. Egyptians who cared deeply about symbols are left blinking at this new hybrid figure, half familiar, half shocking. Quirky tidbit: that false beard wasn't just a prop. Pharaohs had ritual beards made of goat hair or metal strapped on with cords, and they were meant to signal divine kingship. Imagine fastening a stiff, itchy beard every time you had to show up for work. Definitely not the kind of office accessory you'd find at Staples. The ceremonies that mark her full assumption of kingship are lavish. You can picture her ascending the throne in a hall filled with lotus-scented air priests chanting praises to Amun, courtiers bowing low, and trumpeters blasting a sound that rattles the sandstone columns. Somewhere beside her sits the boy Thutmose III, still officially co-king, but clearly overshadowed by the majesty of his stepmother. One mainstream historical fact is that she adopted the full royal titulary, 5 names linked to gods and cosmic order, just like any male pharaoh before her. This wasn't a side gig, this was kingship in its entirety. And in Egypt, where divine order depended on Pharaoh, that made her role non-negotiable. At the same time, she doesn't erase Thutmose III yet. His name still appears beside hers on monuments, his image still carved alongside hers in temples. It's as though she's gently training the kingdom to see 2 kings at once, one an active adult, the other a child, still growing into his role. The boy learns in the background while the woman runs the stage. At night, when the palace finally quiets, you can almost imagine Hatshepsut slipping off the heavy crown, the stiff beard, and the layered linen sighing in relief. Outside, the Nile drifts under the moon, crocodiles sliding silently between the reeds. She probably knows whispers are already circling, that she's overstepped, that the gods may frown, that tradition is bending dangerously. But as she leans back against cushions perfumed with myrrh, there's no doubt she feels the weight of power settling firmly in her hands. And you, drifting with her in this moment, realize Egypt is no longer led by a boy with a fragile claim, but by a woman who has rewritten the script. The regent has vanished. The pharaoh has arrived. The morning sun filters through the haze above Karnak, gilding the colossal pylons with a soft glow. You trail behind a line of priests carrying trays of bread beer and lotus flowers, their linen kilts swaying as they approach the inner sanctuary. Today the temple smells like cedar oil, warm stone and incense thick enough to make your eyes water. And there in the heart of it all stands Hatshepsut, not just pharaoh, but something even more audacious, the daughter of the god Amun himself. She doesn't make this claim lightly. Her rise to pharaoh has bent tradition, even rattled some of the old guard. To smooth things over, she leans on religion, weaving a narrative so dazzling it's hard to argue with. Reliefs carved into the walls of her temple at Deir el-Bahri show a divine scene. Amun himself, king of the gods, visits her mother, Queen Ahmose, in the form of Thutmose. From this union, Hatshepsut is conceived not just royal by blood, but divine by essence. Historians still argue whether this divine birth story was a propaganda masterpiece invented by Hatshepsut's priests, or if it reflected genuine belief woven into state religion. Either way, it's brilliant. If you're skeptical about a woman ruling, well, too bad, because according to this version it wasn't the court, or even the people who chose her. It was the gods. You can almost see the ritual drama acted out during festivals. Priests in leopard skin cloaks chant as they carry gilded statues of Amun through the streets. Citizens throw flowers, clap and bow, not just to honor their god, but to reaffirm Hatshepsut's unique position as his chosen offspring. Her kingship becomes less a political anomaly and more a religious inevitability. Quirky tidbit: the Egyptians loved carving these divine birth scenes with surprisingly tender detail. You'll spot little gods attending the queen in bed, midwives represented by deities, and even the child Hatshepsut being nursed by Hathor herself, the goddess of motherhood and joy. Imagine commissioning a mural that says, "Here's my baby picture. Oh, and by the way, my dad's the king of the gods." In practice, this religious rebranding works like a charm. Hatshepsut appears before her people, not just in the stiff beard and crown of kingship, but also wrapped in the aura of holiness. When she makes offerings at Karnak, the crowd doesn't just see a woman ruling. They see the living, breathing extension of Amun's will. One mainstream historical fact: her temple inscriptions repeatedly emphasize her Ma'at, the cosmic order of truth and balance. She frames herself as restoring Egypt after chaos, a classic pharaonic theme. The difference is that she's a woman, and that twist is justified by divine endorsement carved into stone. At night, after the ceremonies, you can imagine the palace quieting again. Oil lamps flicker against painted walls where lotus motifs curl endlessly. Servants shuffle away, priests retire, and only the hum of cicadas fills the air. Hatshepsut, perhaps reclining on a couch with scented unguents nearby, has secured something few rulers manage: legitimacy beyond question. Of course, skeptics still murmur. Some courtiers probably roll their eyes when no one is looking, muttering that divine stories are convenient when you need them. But for the farmers along the Nile, the stonemasons chiseling hieroglyphs, the merchants unloading incense, the message is clear. Pharaoh Hatshepsut isn't bending tradition, she's fulfilling the will of the gods. And so step by careful step, her kingship doesn't just solidify, it becomes sacred. The desert heat rolls across the cliffs of western Thebes and the air tastes of chalky limestone dust. You climb a winding path, the cliffs towering on either side, like giant sun-bleached walls, until suddenly the valley opens, and there it is, Hatshepsut's masterpiece rising straight from the living rock. Terraces step upward in perfect symmetry, colonnades marching like disciplined soldiers, ramps cutting smooth lines against the jagged cliffs. This is Deir el-Bahri, her mortuary temple, her architectural signature, her way of writing "I was here" into the bones of the earth. From the start, Hatshepsut leans on stone the way some rulers lean on armies. She understands that stone projects permanence, and permanence means legitimacy. Sure, scribes can copy decrees, but papyrus burns and clay tablets crumble. A temple carved into cliffs that's forever, well, almost forever, if you ignore later pharaohs with chisels. Historians still argue whether her chief architect Senenmut was simply a brilliant administrator or something more personal to her. His name appears tucked discreetly in corners of the temple, his statues linger in shadowed chambers, and his loyalty seems absolute. Was he just a trusted official or something closer? The scholarly debates keep churning, though the sandstone itself remains silent. Step onto the first terrace and you hear it, the sound of hammers striking stone, the scrape of copper chisels, the rhythmic grunt of workers hauling blocks on sledges lubricated with water and milk. Imagine hundreds of laborers, their skin darkened by the sun, their linen skirts powdered white with dust, shaping every column and carving. Overseers bark orders, scribes tally supplies, and in the background donkeys bray under baskets of gravel. One mainstream historical fact, Deir el-Bahri was unlike earlier mortuary temples. Instead of a squat rectangle, it stretched upward with terraces and long ramps that echoed the cliffs behind it. This blending of architecture and natural landscape was revolutionary, a visual manifesto declaring her reign in harmony with divine order. Quirky tidbit archaeologists found that some foundation deposits beneath the temple contained small model tools, food offerings, and even tiny alabaster vessels. It's like ancient Egyptians burying a construction time capsule, ensuring the gods had snacks and gear to bless the build. Walk through the colonnades and you'll see reliefs etched into the walls, stories carved in stone for eternity. On one wall, Hatshepsut's divine birth is immortalized Amun, visiting her mother gods, attending her conception, her legitimacy literally set in stone. On another wall you'll glimpse ships sailing to Punt Laden with exotic goods, a scene we'll return to. These walls aren't decoration, they're propaganda campaigns carved with chisels. At dusk, when the workers finally set down their tools, the temple glows golden in the last light. You stand in the silence, hearing the faint hiss of the wind across the cliffs, and realize this isn't just a tomb. It's a stage, a proclamation, a giant exclamation point carved into the desert. Imagine Hatshepsut visiting during construction, riding in a chariot, pulled by sleek horses, servants shading her with fans. She steps out, surveys the terraces, and perhaps allows herself the faintest smile. Every column rising here says, "What words cannot she is Pharaoh, and her reign will endure in stone." And you, standing among the scaffolds and half-carved reliefs, feel the weight of that ambition pressing against the cliffs, daring time itself to forget her. The Nile glitters like a ribbon of bronze under the morning sun, and the docks at Thebes are buzzing with life. Men haul bundles of rope, carpenters pound wooden pegs into planks, and scribes squat nearby, tallying supplies, as if every jar of beer and basket of bread might decide the fate of the expedition. You step closer and feel the breeze snap the square sails of ships unlike any you've seen before, tall, broad, seaworthy. Today Hatshepsut is sending Egypt where few pharaohs dared across the Red Sea, to the mysterious land of Punt. This isn't a military campaign, it's something stranger, softer, an expedition for wealth, incense, exotic goods, and a splash of divine favor. Hatshepsut knows she doesn't need endless wars to prove her kingship. What she needs is spectacle, trade, and treasures that remind everyone that the gods are clearly smiling on her reign. One mainstream historical fact, the walls of Deir el-Bahri depict this journey in astonishing detail. You see tall ships with sails stretched wide, oars dipping in unison, and rows of Egyptian sailors packed tightly on deck. Punt is shown as a lush place with domed houses on stilts, trees heavy with myrrh, and even the Queen of Punt herself drawn with a rounded figure that has fascinated scholars for centuries. Historians still argue whether Punt was located in modern Eritrea, Somalia, or somewhere deeper inland. Its exact location remains one of Egypt's enduring mysteries, like an ancient riddle carved into stone. Quirky tidbit among the treasures brought back were living myrrh trees carefully transported in baskets of soil. Imagine the logistics, hauling entire trees across desert and sea just so they could be replanted in Egyptian soil. It's like trying to FedEx an entire orchard. But those trees, once rooted in temple courtyards, meant that Hatshepsut could harvest divine incense right at home. The voyage itself must have been grueling. Picture the sailors on the Red Sea, waves slapping the hull, the salty air burning their throats. They rode under a punishing sun by day and slept on deck under a sky bright with stars at night. They faced storms, uncertain waters, and the constant threat of running low on fresh water. And yet when the ships finally glided into Punt's harbours, the reward was staggering. Incense, ebony, ivory, gold, baboons, leopard skins, all of it loaded onto the ships until they rode low in the water. The Egyptians carved the moment in triumph, foreigners bringing gifts, strange animals trotting at their handlers' sides, exotic scents wafting through the air. For Hatshepsut, this wasn't just trade, it was a public relations masterstroke. She could stand before her people and declare that she had opened the gates of wealth itself. Back in Thebes, imagine the crowds thronging the docks when the expedition returned. Ships creak under the weight of treasures, sailors stumble ashore, sunburned but victorious, and priests rush forward to claim incense for temple rituals. Hatshepsut appears resplendent in her regalia, accepting the exotic gifts as proof that Amun himself blesses her reign. At night, after the fanfare quiets, you picture her inhaling the first curls of incense from Punt. The fragrance, resinous, sweet, otherworldly fills her chamber, mixing with the hum of cicadas outside. To her courtiers, it is the smell of divine favor. To you, it's the perfume of strategy drifting gently through the palace corridors. And in this way, by sending ships instead of armies, Hatshepsut secures not just wealth, but memory. Centuries later, the images of those ships carved into the cliffs still sail, frozen forever in stone. The sun climbs lazily over Thebes, and the temple courtyards come alive with the clatter of sandals and the drone of scribes reading out tallies. You wander through the bustle of officials holding papyrus scrolls and overseers barking instructions to workers lugging baskets of grain. Egypt under Hatshepsut's hand is humming like a well-oiled machine. Tonight's story isn't about ships on the Red Sea or monuments in stone. It's about the quieter gears of empire money grain and the endless flow of resources that make a kingdom run. Hatshepsut is clever here. She knows that temples aren't just places for prayer, they're economic engines. Land owned by Amun's priests stretches for miles, producing barley, wheat, and cattle. Hatshepsut reorganizes these estates, streamlining how offerings flow in and how wealth flows back out. The god may get his share, but the crown, meaning Hatshepsut keeps a steady hand on the ledger. One mainstream historical fact inscriptions credit her with restoring temple revenues that had declined in earlier reigns. In her version of the story, she isn't hoarding riches, but ensuring that the gods themselves are properly funded. And if that just so happens to strengthen her own coffers, well, that's cosmic balance in action. Quirky tidbit, ancient Egyptian scribes sometimes recorded payments in beer rather than silver or gold. A worker might be listed as receiving 4 jugs of beer and a sack of bread. You can almost hear a foreman shouting across a courtyard, "Don't forget to write down his 6-pack." Egypt's economy was foamy long before pubs made it fashionable. Historians still argue whether her economic moves were revolutionary or just careful housekeeping. Was she centralizing power in her hands or simply fixing the books after years of neglect? Whatever the motive, the results speak for themselves. Egypt's building projects surge, trade flourishes, and workers are fed and housed well enough to keep chisels and hammers moving from dawn until dusk. Step into the palace storerooms and you'd see stacks of jars labeled with ink honey wine oil. Granaries bulge with barley, their mud brick walls cool against the desert heat. Scribes sit cross-legged reeds, scratching records into neat columns, while overseers pace back and forth, making sure no one skims off the top. Somewhere in the shadows, a clerk yawns and wishes someone would invent a calculator. At festivals, the wealth shows itself in spectacle. Temples drip with garlands of flowers, incense smoke curls into the sky, and gilded statues are carried on the shoulders of sweating priests. Hatshepsut presides in dazzling regalia, the message clear: the gods are pleased, the economy is thriving, and Egypt is under control. And through it all, you notice how her style of rulership leans toward patience. She isn't rushing into reckless wars or throwing the treasury into one colossal statue. She builds, steadily invests carefully, and ensures that Egypt's heartbeat, the Nile's cycle of flood, sow and harvest, remains stable under her watch. At night, when the last scribe puts down his reed pen and the storerooms fall quiet, you can almost hear the empire breathing steadily like a sleeper, at peace. And you realize this may be Hatshepsut's greatest skill, not dazzling victories or dramatic speeches, but the patient, quiet management of resources that keeps Egypt strong enough to dream bigger tomorrow. The night air over Thebes is cooler now, and as you wander up the sloping paths toward the cliffs, a new silhouette dominates the horizon. It rises like a flight of stone steps, frozen in motion, each terrace stacked neatly above the last. This is Deir el-Bahri, Hatshepsut's masterpiece, her temple of millions of years. By torchlight it glows pale against the desert rock like moonlight captured in limestone. You step closer and notice the precision colonnades marching in straight lines, ramps, sweeping upward statues lined with a rhythm that feels almost musical. Hatshepsut didn't just want a tomb, she wanted a stage where her reign could play forever. And this temple carved into the cliffs of western Thebes is as much performance as architecture. One mainstream historical fact, Deir el-Bahri's walls are covered with reliefs showing her greatest achievements, most famously the expedition to Punt. But there are also scenes of her divine birth where the god Amun is shown, fathering her, legitimizing her rule as part of the cosmic order. Visitors walking through these halls would not only admire stonework, but be quietly reminded that their ruler was touched by the divine. Quirky tidbit: the temple's design borrowed heavily from Mentuhotep II, a king who ruled centuries earlier on the very same site. It's like Hatshepsut looked across the valley at an ancient monument and thought, yes, but let's do it bigger, cleaner, and with more columns, please. Even in antiquity, rulers were remixing old classics. Historians still argue whether Hatshepsut herself sketched out the plan or whether her brilliant architect Senenmut deserves most of the credit. His name appears in connection with several of her works, and the closeness between them, whether purely professional or something more, is still debated in lecture halls and late-night arguments among Egyptologists. Inside the temple would have been alive with ritual, priests moving through incense-filled corridors, chants echoing under high ceilings, offerings of bread and beer laid before carved gods. On the terraces, gardens may have bloomed, watered by ingenious irrigation channels that drew life from the desert's edge. Imagine pomegranates and sycamores against the pale stone, a splash of green against gold. For ordinary Egyptians, visiting Deir el-Bahri must have been overwhelming. They'd walk up the ramps, craning their necks at colossal statues of Hatshepsut in full pharaonic regalia. Some statues show her with the beard of a king, others in a more feminine guise, as if she were reminding visitors she could embody every role at once. To stand there was to be confronted with power sculpted into permanence. At dusk, as the sun dips behind the cliffs, shadows pool in the courtyards and the walls seem to whisper with carved stories. You picture Hatshepsut herself standing on a high terrace looking across the Nile toward Karnak, knowing that her temple faces the rising sun each morning. It is an eternal conversation between East and West life and death, power and memory. And tonight, as you linger in that shadowed colonnade, the air heavy with the faint smell of incense and dust, you realize the brilliance of her strategy. This temple is not only her monument, it is her argument. Every block, every relief says, I belong here, I was chosen, I endure. The torchlight fades behind Deir el-Bahri, and you drift instead into the hushed chambers of Karnak, where the smell of incense still clings to the air like a second skin. Here, amid rows of towering columns and echoing courtyards, Hatshepsut makes her boldest theological move. She isn't satisfied with ruling as a woman dressed like a king. She wants the gods themselves to say she was destined all along. So she commissions inscriptions that tell a story unlike any bedtime tale you've ever heard. Reliefs carved into temple walls show Amun, the chief god of Thebes, striding into the royal chambers, disguised as her earthly father. The goddess Mut Another divine attendant stand nearby, and the union produces a child, not just any child, but Hatshepsut herself. From the moment of conception, the story insists she was marked as divine. One mainstream historical fact: these divine birth reliefs still exist on the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. They were propaganda carved in stone, meant to convince priests, officials, and everyday Egyptians that her authority came straight from the heavens. Quirky tidbit: in one scene, the creator god Khnum is shown shaping Hatshepsut on his potter's wheel, moulding her little body out of clay like a pot. You can almost imagine him squinting and muttering, "Bit more sand, fewer cracks this time," as if gods get pottery-class nerves too. Historians still argue whether Egyptians fully bought this divine narrative or whether it was more symbolic than literal. Was it a clever way to wrap her unusual kingship in cosmic legitimacy? Or did people actually whisper that their queen had godly DNA? Either way, the image stuck, and the priests of Amun, never ones to turn down offerings, seemed perfectly happy to play along. Walking through Karnak at night, you see how the story glows in flickering lamplight. The gods are painted in rich reds and blues, their outlines crisp against the golden walls. Priests shuffle past, chanting softly, while scribes unroll papyri to record ritual inventories. The whole place feels like a grand theatre, with Hatshepsut as both playwright and star. The psychological effect is immense. For officials kneeling before her, it's no longer just loyalty to a mortal. They are bowing to someone whose very life was scripted by the gods. In a world where the divine and earthly blurred every day, that's more than persuasion, it's destiny written into stone. By weaving her story into Egypt's most sacred temple, she ensures that every festival, every prayer, every torchlight ritual reinforces her legitimacy. Even centuries later, long after her name was chiseled away by successors, fragments of these carvings still whisper her message. You pause in the hypostyle hall, the columns looming like stone papyrus stalks around you. The air is cool, heavy, and hushed, and you realize Hatshepsut has managed something remarkable. She didn't just claim the throne, she rewrote her very origin, folding herself into myth so tightly that separating woman from king or mortal from divine becomes nearly impossible. The night drifts on, and the Nile reflects the silver glow of the moon, rippling like a sheet of hammered metal. You follow the river south into Nubia, where sandstone cliffs guard the passage and dark waters run swift between them. Here, Hatshepsut's banners once fluttered, carried by troops, traders, and stonecutters. Though she is often remembered for her peaceful reign, don't be fooled, she knew when to send soldiers and when to send masons. One mainstream historical fact: Hatshepsut oversaw expeditions into Nubia, Egypt's southern neighbor, not only to keep it loyal, but to secure gold mines and trade routes. Nubia had long been a land of immense wealth, where veins of gold glimmered in the earth. The Egyptians called it Tarseti, the land of the bow, because Nubian archers were legendary. Hatshepsut ensured that these resources flowed northward, feeding her temples and treasuries. Quirky tidbit inscriptions suggest that donkeys, not camels, were the preferred beasts of burden during these expeditions. Imagine a long caravan of stubborn donkeys braying under their loads of gold dust, ivory, and ostrich feathers. Somewhere in the line, a handler probably muttered, "Should have just brought fewer statues home." Historians still argue whether these Nubian campaigns were true military actions or largely ceremonial displays of dominance. Did Hatshepsut really march south with armed force, or were her victories more like staged parades to remind Nubians who was boss? The lack of dramatic battle scenes in her record suggests she preferred diplomacy and steady tribute over risky warfare. Beyond Nubia, Hatshepsut cast her gaze eastward. Inscriptions hint at mining expeditions in the Sinai Peninsula, where turquoise and copper glittered in desert caves. Workers carved her cartouches into the rock, as if to declare, "Yes, even here, Hatshepsut reigns." Stand for a moment in the mine's darkness, the air thick with dust, the metallic tang of copper clinging to your tongue. Torches flickering against walls etched with faint hieroglyphs. The workers swing picks until their hands blister, while overseers keep tally. Even in these harsh outposts, her presence is stamped into stone. And always there is the hum of organization ships ferrying goods up the Nile, scribes recording shipments, priests blessing offerings of Nubian gold before they're melted into statues of Amun. It's a quiet reminder that Hatshepsut's empire runs on logistics as much as faith. When you drift back to Thebes in your mind, you see how these far-flung ventures feed directly into her monuments. Every obelisk, every colonnade, every polished block owes something to the flow of Nubian gold or Sinai stone. At night, the Nile laps gently against the quay, and the air smells faintly of silt and river reeds. You can almost hear the bleating of donkeys returning from faraway deserts, and the clink of chisels carving her name into yet another block of stone. In that sound, the borders of Egypt feel smaller, pulled inward by the patient hand of a queen who knows that every expedition, however dusty or distant, adds another thread to the tapestry of her reign. The palace is quiet tonight, torches flickering low against polished stone walls, and you catch the faint murmur of whispers tucked into corners where the air feels heavy with speculation. For all her monuments and expeditions, Hatshepsut's reign was not without its shadows, and at the center of those shadows stands one man, Senenmut. He is everywhere in her story, chief steward, architect, tutor, to her daughter Neferua, overseer of works, and the name carved discreetly into statues and blocks across Thebes. When you walk through the terraces of Deir el-Bahri, it's his genius you feel in the harmony of columns and ramps. When you glimpse lists of offerings, his hand tallies them. Senenmut is both the stagehand and, some whisper perhaps, the co-star. One mainstream historical fact: over 24 statues of Senenmut survive unusually lavish for a non-royal. Some even show him cradling Neferua, the young princess, emphasizing his closeness to the royal family. That kind of prominence suggests immense trust and perhaps envy from rivals. Quirky tidbit archaeologists discovered a hidden tomb linked to him beneath the very terraces of Hatshepsut's temple. It was unfinished and never used, as if he planned to anchor himself eternally under her monument. Imagine the audacity of building yourself a secret suite under your boss's colossal project. It's the ancient Egyptian equivalent of sneaking a hammock into the CEO's office ceiling. Historians still argue whether Senenmut and Hatshepsut shared more than politics and stonework. Was he, her lover, a confidant, or simply a genius administrator who knew how to ride royal favor? The silence of records is deafening, leaving only speculation and the faint traces of gossip carved into graffiti by workers. Step into that graffiti for a moment. A crude drawing tucked into the cliffs shows a woman, possibly Hatshepsut, and a man, possibly Senenmut, in a compromising pose. Is it satire, scandal, or just the doodle of a bored laborer? No one can say, but it reminds you that behind all the divine propaganda, these were still human beings, vulnerable to rumor and ridicule. In the palace corridors, imagine how it felt: jealous officials muttering about Senenmut's rapid rise, priests watching carefully, scribes rolling their eyes at yet another statue of him. And yet, through it all, Hatshepsut kept him close, allowing his influence to seep into architecture, administration, and her daughter's upbringing. At night, when the clamor of building fades and the incense curls thinly in the air, you picture Senenmut standing on the terraces of Deir el-Bahri, gazing up at the cliffs. Did he feel pride at shaping eternity, or did he feel small beneath the weight of it? And, somewhere in the shadows, did Hatshepsut herself pause to wonder how history would remember the two of them, queen and steward? Ruler and architect whispered names entangled forever in stone and speculation. The desert wind picks up tonight, hissing softly against the cliffs of western Thebes, and you feel a shift in the air. Hatshepsut is no longer the ambitious builder of obelisks and temples, but a ruler entering the twilight of her reign. Years have passed, her monuments gleam in the sun, and the smell of incense from Punt still lingers in temple courtyards, but time, as always, is patient and unrelenting. One mainstream historical fact records suggest Hatshepsut ruled for roughly 2 decades one of the longest reigns of any female pharaoh. Her final years were marked not by dramatic wars or scandals, but by continuity. Egypt stayed prosperous, the temples thrived, and the Nile's rhythm kept her people fed. Quirky tidbits somewhere in this quieter era, exotic animals like giraffes and baboons appear in Egyptian reliefs, likely gifts from distant lands brought through the trade routes she had nurtured. Imagine walking through a palace garden and spotting a giraffe craning its neck above the sycamores. Even the gardeners must have sighed, "We did not plan for that." Historians still argue how Hatshepsut's life ended. Some claim she died peacefully in her 50s, succumbing to illness like any mortal. Others point to traces of arthritis, diabetes, or even cancer found in a mummified body that may belong to her. A few fringe whispers wonder if foul play was involved, though the evidence is faint, more the stuff of late-night speculation than carved certainty. What's clear is that her death left a throne in transition. Thutmose III, the nephew she had groomed and co-ruled with, stepped forward into full kingship. For him, it was both a liberation and a reckoning. He inherited a stable, wealthy Egypt, but also a legacy overshadowed by the woman who had worn the crown before him. In the dim light of her final nights, picture Hatshepsut walking the terraces of Deir el-Bahri, her joints stiff, her breath slower, the scent of stone dust and myrrh mingling in the desert air. She has built monuments that will stand for millennia, carved her name into granite obelisks, and etched her story into walls with divine authority. But she must have known, as all rulers do, that memory is fickle and successors rarely let the past rest untouched. You linger with her in that silence in the shadow of columns glowing pale beneath the moon, and realize that even queens who counted themselves divine cannot outpace time forever. The night deepens and you find yourself wandering through the broken echoes of history, the air thick with dust and absence. Hatshepsut is gone now, her body laid to rest, though its resting place would vanish into mystery for centuries. What remains in Egypt is not reverence, but something stranger, a campaign of erasure. One mainstream historical fact, many of Hatshepsut's images and cartouches were chiseled off monuments. Her statues smashed, her name scraped away, as if the stone itself were being made to forget. The work began during the later years of Thutmose III, the very man she had raised to power. Quirky tidbits, some of the erasures were almost comically clumsy. On certain reliefs, artisans hacked away her face, but left her body intact, so a half-finished, not Hatshepsut figure still struts across the wall. It's like trying to erase someone from a family photo by scribbling only over the head. You know exactly who it was supposed to be. Historians still argue why it happened. Was it vengeance? Thutmose III finally striking back after years in her shadow? Was it a tidy political move to make the line of kings look seamless, erasing the anomaly of a female ruler? Or was it later, priests anxious about theological order who ordered her removed the motives like the chisel marks remain jagged and uneven? You walk through Deir el-Bahri again, only now the colonnades are scarred, statues toppled and inscriptions patched over. In the torchlight, the damage looks fresh, cruel. And yet, ironically, it was this very vandalism that helped archaeologists centuries later notice something unusual had been hidden. The ghost of Hatshepsut clung to every scratch and hollow where her name had once been. Her mummy, too, became part of the puzzle. For generations, her burial was uncertain, her remains scattered or hidden. Some thought her body lost forever. Others whispered she had been buried hastily, her tomb usurped. The mystery made her reign all the more ghostly, a half-remembered dream the sands refused to yield. And yet, even erased, she was not silenced. The obelisks she raised at Karnak still pierced the sky. The temples she carved into the cliffs still bore her story in faint reliefs. Her innovations in trade, her monuments, her calm stewardship of Egypt, they remained woven into the stone, waiting for time to return her voice. At night, when you stand among those battered statues and chipped cartouches, the silence is heavy. You can almost hear the hammer strikes that tried to erase her, but you also hear what survived the rhythm of columns still standing, the faint shimmer of obelisks catching moonlight, the persistence of her presence in absence. And you realize something: erasure too can be a kind of memory. By trying so hard to scrub her away, her successors made her impossible to forget. The desert grows quiet now, the stars stretching endlessly above, and you drift toward the final echoes of Hatshepsut's story, the afterlife not only of her soul, but of her memory. Centuries pass like grains of sand through an hourglass, and Egypt itself changes hands again and again. The great queen who built temples, launched ships, and ruled with patience becomes a ghost in half-erased inscriptions, her name unspoken, her face hammered away. Yet she waits. One mainstream historical fact: in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists began piecing her story back together. At Deir el-Bahri, Edouard Naville uncovered her temple reliefs, still faintly telling of the voyage to Punt and her divine birth. Later in 2007, researchers announced they had likely identified her mummy, a body once dismissed as anonymous, now linked through a tooth that fit into a missing jaw socket. Quirky tidbit: for years before that discovery, a coffin labeled the Elder Lady sat quietly in the Cairo Museum's storage rooms. Visitors walked past dusty shelves, not realizing that one of Egypt's greatest rulers was lying there waiting for her name to be spoken again. Historians still argue how to judge her reign. Was she a usurper who sidelined her nephew, or a caretaker who kept Egypt stable until he matured? Was she ambitious beyond measure, or simply pragmatic, shaping herself into whatever form a king with a beard, a daughter of Amun, the times required? The debates continue, fueled by every chisel mark and papyrus scrap her reign left behind. Today, when you walk through her temple terraces or crane your neck at her obelisks, you see not just stone, but resilience. Hatshepsut endured not only the challenges of her lifetime, but the attempts to erase her afterward. In many ways, her story is more complete because of the gaps, more vivid because of the scars. Now picture her in the afterlife as Egyptians imagined it, sailing in a golden bark across fields of reeds, her car nourished by offerings of bread and beer. Perhaps she glances back toward Thebes, watching her temple gleam in the sun, her obelisk still reaching skyward, her memory finally restored after millennia of silence. And as you rest here, listening to the faint hum of desert wind and the imagined beat of distant drums, her story settles like dust across your mind. Hatshepsut, the patient builder, the woman who became a king, the queen who counted on time itself to carry her name forward again. And now, with the tale of Hatshepsut complete, it's time to let the story soften like lantern light flickering lower in a quiet room. The deserts of Egypt fade gently from view, their cliffs dissolving into pale shadow, the Nile melting into silence. The bustle of workers, the chants of priests, the clatter of chisels, all of it drifts away until only calm remains. You feel the air grow slower, as though the night itself has settled a heavy blanket across the world. The stars above, so sharp and endless before now, blur into a soft shimmer, more like candle wax melting than distant suns. Even Hatshepsut's towering monuments, her terraces, her obelisks begin to shrink, not erased, but simply resting their edges worn smooth by time and memory. In this gentle quiet, imagine her spirit drifting calmly across the field of reeds, her boat gliding over still waters, reeds swaying softly at the banks. There is no hurry here, no need for ambition or stone. Only the rhythm of water, the murmur of wind, and the eternal warmth of a sun that never scorches, only soothes. Let your own breath match that rhythm, slow, steady even, each inhale a little lighter, each exhale a little deeper. The story you've followed has carried you across deserts and rivers, through temples and gardens, but now the journey folds itself away like papyrus, rolled gently shut. And as you rest, know that the queen who built so patiently reminds you of something simple, that time itself is the greatest builder of all, smoothing every edge, softening every memory, carrying us all toward rest. So close your eyes, drift with the river, and let sleep arrive as quietly as the Nile at night.